Good morning. Many years ago I was a youth group leader with 3 others in the local church. We had a youth group of nice kids out of the church predominantly, gentle, fun kids. 15 to 20 of them each Friday night. Somehow we got connected with this group of boys who roamed the streets. They were slightly older, mid-teens, and we built relationships with them to the extent where they came and joined the youth group. These boys were used to hanging out around the community, around the town on a Friday and Saturday night, getting up to all sorts of mischief, harassing the shopkeepers and neighbours, whoever. Some antisocial behaviour, bored and mucking around. Anyway, they joined the group, and that created some interesting tensions between a group of young people who knew how to behave and what was expected of them in a youth group and in church buildings. But also we walked a fine line with some of the leaders of the church who had high expectations of what would happen in their church building. Anyway, one night the group had grown. There were about 50 young people, and we were in a bigger building, a range of activities, fun, games, activities around a theme. And one of the leaders would share a devotion at one point. This night, in the midst of the devotion in this particular room, one of the younger guys out of this group of boys was being disruptive. He was laughing and carrying on, making jokes, interrupting all the time. And through it, we leaders had tried to say, look, just calm down, stop it, behave, respect, dignity, all those sort of things the rules of the youth group. Don't interrupt, don't speak while others are talking, all that sort of stuff. Behave yourself. Nothing changed. He just kept going and egging on others. And in the end, my anger exploded into rage, and I shouted at him and told him to stop being stupid and to behave himself and stop being disrespectful and to shut up, that sort of thing. It had the desired effect. He was quiet. When I looked over a couple of minutes later, he sat with his head in his hands, on his knees, sulking. And I knew at that moment I'd crossed the line. Whatever I'd said and done may have been correct in some ways, but it caused pain and crushed him. I'd done wrong. This week we continue to read the the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's story. And Jesus takes the law and he said, I don't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And he uses this kind of phrase, you've heard it said, but I tell you this. You've heard it said, do not kill, do not murder. But I tell you, anyone who holds anger in their heart and lets it fester away into hatred and judgment and violence has committed murder in their heart already. In other words, it's not just the act of killing someone, the physical action. It's the attitude of hatred, of judgment, of retaliation, vengeance, revenge, that results in violent thoughts, words and actions. That is as wrong as the killing. It often leads to killing of some description, whether it's the body or the spirit. Perhaps as with me, with this young man, where I crushed him with my words. He speaks of reconciliation. For Jesus, the currency of the reign of God, of the way God has in the world, created the world, is relationships grounded in love and justice. And yet, too often we take legalisms and literalisms of the law, what's right, what's wrong, how we can maintain control and order in our own way, above relationships, as I did with that young man. And so he talks about reconciliation. If you've got something against a brother or sister, or they got something against you, go and deal with it. Take someone with you if you need to, but deal with your differences and your conflicts. Don't allow them to fester away in you and that anger become hatred and judgment and result in violent words or actions. Whether the violence goes inward and hurts you, or outward and is expressed in other ways. Deal with your conflicts. Deal with the issues between you. Where there are differences, where there are cultural, language differences, where there's differences in gender and sexuality and age or lifestyle or belief system or politics or whatever it is that comes between you that is different, that causes friction or tension or anger or judgment, or deal with it. Become reconciled. Now, I need to point out that there are situations in our lives where there is abuse, deep abuse or violence that could be sexual, physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual, where the hurt and the pain are too deep and where reconciliation is not going to be possible. It's too vulnerable and difficult. But Jesus says we need to work with those people to bring healing into their lives so that they don't turn their anger, their injustice, their fear, their pain inward. We need to bring healing. We're not talking about reconciling them with their perpetrators necessarily. This is the normal relationships we have within families, within communities, within churches and organisations and within our world. Seek reconciliation and peace. It's hard work, but relationships are important, most important. Jesus is inviting us to hold relationship and to develop relationship and to work on relationship, rather than use laws and rules and regulations to build barriers and wedges between people. Too often we build these barriers and walls and keep people out, judge them and hate them. Whether they've done something to us or they're just different, we don't like them. We disagree. And he says that's not the way of God. The way of God is love and relationship and working through it and working with each other. And he encourages us to do that. There's more to the story with that young man. After the talk had finished, after the leader had given a talk, the young people went off to do some other activities into the bigger space. And I stayed behind, and when they'd all left, I went up to this young bloke who I'd upset, who I'd crushed. He was still sitting with his hands in his head, his head in his hands on his knees, sulking and upset. I went over and I apologised profusely and said I was wrong. I shouldn't have said what I said. I'm sorry. He'd upset us and he'd done the wrong thing, but that didn't excuse me. At first I kept at it, trying to explain and apologise and make restitution as best I could. Finally, he opened up and I could see there were tears in his eyes. He'd been really upset. And he began to open up and talk. And for 15 or 20 minutes we talked. And I asked him about his life, about who he was. I didn't really know him. I knew he was on the edge of that group, one of the younger ones of that boys' group. Always trying to earn his place, to prove himself, doing silly things and inane things, trying to impress others. And I recognised that now his self-esteem was pretty low. But he told me things about his life that surprised me, shocked me. Things that were so far away from my own experience of life. Things that a young 15-year-old should never have to endure. There was lots of stuff there. But I remember him talking about his stepfather. His mum remarried or had this new partner. And he would go out drinking, particularly on the weekends, Fridays and Saturday nights, and he'd come home drunk and violent. And if the young bloke was in bed asleep, he was likely to be dragged out of bed and given a hiding. Times when the stepfather lashed out at the boy's mum and hit her, he would step in to try and protect her, and he would get beaten. And so he found this group of guys that roamed the streets at night that he could belong to in some way. and stay out at night and come home when his stepfather was well in bed and he could safely go to bed and sleep through the night. What the morning might bring was a different story. At least he could sleep. When there was nothing happened with this group of boys and they weren't roaming the streets that night, he might go home and sleep with his dog in the garage because that was safer than being in his bed. I heard this story and I realised I didn't understand. I guess this guy didn't need to sit and listen to a nice youth group talk about how much God loves you and how to live as God's people. Really good stuff. And he certainly didn't need me misunderstanding him and abusing him and shouting at him. He needed a relationship. He needed someone to talk to. He needed to be understood. He needed to be valued and affirmed for who he was. And that happens in relationship. Now, I don't know what happened to him in the long run. We'd lost contact over the years. But that night led to me and the other leaders relating to him in a different way. Not just him, but the other young people in the youth group. Recognising that each has a story and experience, pain and struggle, and that their behaviour signifies something. Rather than get angry, or when I do get angry, rather than take a negative path, I learn to take a positive path. A path that builds relationship. A path that opens up relationship. A way of love. I'm still learning this. I still have conflicts and I still don't know how to deal with them, or I still have issues, and life is complex and difficult, and I like to be in control, and I like the rules and so forth to be followed and the order to be there, like we all do. But I'm learning that life is messier, and that the rules and the regulations and the laws and whatever they are there to help us. Mostly they're there to help us work at relationships, to be in relationship. Relationships grounded in love and justice. And that my anger is a result or a reaction to pain or hurt or the injustice I see around me, either experience or see around me in the lives of others. And it invites me into a positive way to deal with that, to build relationships or to fight against injustice and to work for the common good and the well-being. It encourages me to be inclusive, to understand that people have different lives, different ways, different experiences, different things that God calls them to and has created them to be. And if I listen to their story and develop relationship, even when I disagree with their politics or their ideologies or their faith or belief systems or even their ways of life, I might learn something. I might learn something from them and they might learn something from me. And together we share this life on this earth. Jesus invites us into relationships and to find ways of working and living together well in love and justice.